Hello. I know this is going to be a long video because I made some notes for myself and there are lots of them. Sorry about that, but I thought I should warn you. Okay, now I'll start by pointing out that one of my subscribers left a note under one of my videos recently saying, "Why are you always posing questions to which there are no answers?" And I'm afraid I've got a question here to which there is no answer again, so I'm just preparing you. It's to do with democracy and, well, it's how much control we are prepared to allow our political leaders to have over us. And I'm going to return to the idea of the 15-minute neighbourhood because it's something I discovered after I'd made my last video. It's all over the place and it's in America too. So you guys in the USA, you're going to have that problem as well. I realised it's not a problem of traffic or ecology or clean air or anything else. It's a problem of democracy. And I'm going to explain, for those of you who haven't seen the previous video, I started off by talking about the city of Oxford, which is notoriously congested, and the council leaders there, the local government, has decided to sort out the problem by dividing the city into zones and then effectively preventing people from driving from one zone into the next zone. You can get into the next zone, but what you've got to do is you've got to take a road out of town and go round and then come back in again, which of course, well, doubles, triples, or maybe even quadruples your journey. And that's supposed to be an attempt to cut congestion in the centre of Oxford. What it will do, of course, is add pollution as the traffic there's got to be more traffic doing longer trips. And it will also add to the suffering of the poor people who live on ring roads. Generally speaking, at least in Britain, it's the poor people who live on the ring roads and the sides of the highways. It's the same in America. I remember when we lived in Stamford, there was the 101, I think it was, and the poorer houses, when we were looking for flats, apartments to stay in, we couldn't afford very much. We were living right next to the 101. All right, so the irony is that it's socialist councils who are actually pushing for these 15-minute neighbourhood type solutions, which impacts the poor far more than the middle class. And I'm interrupting myself now to tell you that I'm Granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds, and I let you know when I've uploaded a new video on one of my social media platforms. That is, I am at Granniopteryx on Twitter, Gab and Parler. I do urge you to subscribe to one of those because YouTube is a little careless about informing people when I've uploaded videos. Also, YouTube is a bit careless about keeping my subscribers subscribed. So if you are subscribed to me on YouTube, check it out now, please. And if you're not subscribed, please subscribe and see what happens. Also, you can help my channel by liking and sharing. Click that like button, and you can help financially, buy me a coffee or one of the links below. Right, that's it. Back to the show. It's not just Oxford we're talking about. There are many towns and cities in Britain who are doing the same thing. They are just choosing different terminology, maybe terminology that sounds a little bit better. Say, for instance, places like Birmingham, I think they're thinking about it. But anyway, whatever. They can't zone that town in the same way as Oxford reckoned it could be zoned, so they have another name. they're called LTNs, that is low traffic neighbourhoods. Doesn't that sound nice? And what happens is you get these giant plant pots and you put them at one end of an access road, and then you force the traffic to go all the way round to get into that neighbourhood round the back or round another route. And it's basically become, either by accident or design, a way to protect middle-class neighbourhoods at the expense of the poor, basically. Well, why should the councils do that? Well, you see, the Labour councils get the vote of the poor anyway. There are many very poor people who vote Labour because they think that if they vote Conservatives, I don't know what, the Conservatives are going to herd them into, DP camps or something. I've no idea what they think, but they end up voting for Labour anyway. So it's the middle classes that you have to do the fighting for. And if you make these little middle class areas havens of peace and quiet, then you're more likely to get the vote. I think that's what's going through their mind. There's another thing, of course, as Cecil Northcote Parkinson said, work expands to fit the time available. And councils are always trying to make more time available for more work, and low traffic neighbourhoods, or even the 15-minute nonsense, will give more work to the council. There's all sorts of bureaucratic processing that will be involved in this. Writing off and pursuing penalties, giving exemptions and licenses, and in some cases, more sinisterly, video surveillance. Some say the 15-minute neighbourhood thing, that's not being solved by bollards, that's being solved by video surveillance of the cars going in and out of Oxford. So, look, I'm going to go through now a quick history of taxation and how it's affected the vote, because the two are closely related. We will start, not go back to prehistory or anything, we'll start with William the Conqueror taking over Britain and installing a feudal system. The feudal system was a pyramid. The king was on the top, then there were the barons, then there were the knights, then there were the peasants. At the time, there wasn't that much of a middle class. And of course, the feudal system broke down as the middle class expanded, but that's another story. Now, at the time William started his system, all the money that was of any account was coming from land, the products of land, wool. Britain was a huge wool exporter and processor, food, just generally, and it all needed paying for, and that all the taxes from that went up the pyramid. So you might say in that situation it was the barons who were the only people who had the vote. After all, if you remember, they all got together and forced King John to sign the first Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta. But it came from a perfectly reasonable place. It was the king led the country. The barons fought for the king on behalf of the king in any battle that might have happened. And then the knights fought for the barons, and the peasants fought for the knights or the barons or the king, depending on which one was their immediate head. Now, the peasants were serfs mostly. They weren't slaves, and that meant that if they went to fight, say, a foreign war, they got a share in the whatever was looted from the places that they'd done the fighting. So when and sometimes if they'd done really good service, they might also get their freedom. They might get that plot of land which belonged to the knight or the baron. They might get that for themselves. So there was always a chance, if they went to war for whichever was their immediate superior, they would be rewarded far beyond living the life of an average peasant. So basically the vote depended on whether you were a member of a fighting force, which accounts for why men were the people who had the vote in whatever form it came. As society developed, of course, the fighting force idea became less and less important, and the same applied for taxes. When the king needed extra money for a war, he'd ask the barons, who demand from the knights and so on. But when there was a middle class, then the king would have to call representatives of the middle class to ask them to set up taxes in their towns or in their guild or whatever to give to the king for the pursuit of this war. So you could say those people had the vote, and that was the first idea of the parliament. And so the vote gradually shifted from the lords who owned the knights, who owned the peasants, to people who owned property. And they were the ones who paid the taxes, a lot of them. And so you might then ask, well, weren't women property owners? And yes, they were. And the first inkling of a change in the situation happened in 1866, when a shop owner called Lily Maxwell discovered that by mistake she was on a list of voters in a certain town. So I don't know how it was discovered, but there was an early suffragist called Lydia Maxwell, and she convinced Lydia Becker. She convinced Lily Maxwell to actually go and vote. I don't know how she heard of it. I don't know whether Mrs. Maxwell actually contacted Mrs. Becker, but whatever. And Lily Becker went to the town hall or wherever it was where you had to cast your vote, and she went and she cast her vote. Now, at that time, you had to say for whom you were voting, so it was quite clear she was voting. She had to go up and she had to say, I vote for whoever it was, and everybody heard, and they had to accept a vote because she was there on the list. Now, at that time, in that place, almost everybody in the hall cheered and applauded. And I've said this before, society changes not when the top decides to change it, but when the ideas come from the people, when the ideas are abroad and generally recognised from the people. And it was obvious that everybody was in favour of this system being changed. So within a few months, a whole lot of female shop owners registered themselves to vote, or tried to, and very soon after a law was changed which allowed female property owners to vote in local elections. And you could say, yeah, this is reasonable. These were women who had a stake in the running of that particular area, and the necessity for that was recognised, but not for national elections. And obviously the feeling was, in national elections, you are voting for a system that can take you to war. And so men took preeminence because it was men who were going to go to war. Obviously, that wouldn't be all men, and you might have made that argument, but that was the idea behind it, and it came from the medieval. It had this provenance all the way back to medieval times, when the people who could influence were the king were the people who could pick up arms or collect soldiers for the king to defend the country or pursue foreign adventures in other countries. But earlier on in the 19th century, there had been a reform on national elections, allowing all men as property owners to vote. And by the way, specifically saying that women couldn't vote. That was the Reform Act. That would have been in the early 1830s. And that was just about, that time was just about, in every way, for legal disabilities between about 1800 and, say, like 1850 or whatever. That was just about the worst time to be a woman in the entire stretch of British history. That was when they had the least amount of power, oddly enough, with a queen, the most powerful woman in the world, in charge of, nominally in charge of everything. I digress. Okay, so from the beginning of the 19th century, more or less, well, the first third of it, after the first third of the 19th century, all men who owned property were qualified to vote because they were considered, in national elections, because they were considered to have a stake in the society, which is certainly taxes, and also to do with military in some way. And but that wasn't a big deal, because you have to remember, until the 20th century, most people in Britain rented their properties. They didn't own them. And even in town, they rented from big landlords, generally builders, built a whole lot, and then they rented out the houses. Or factory owners built accommodation of a sort for the workers, and then the workers rented the houses, sometimes at very, very low rents and sometimes extortionate, depending on what the factory owner was like. The same went for mines, any sort of industry like that. And it wasn't just the poor. You may remember, if you've read Pride and Prejudice, a character called Mr. Bingley. And the first we hear of him, right at the beginning of the novel, was that he was going to rent, what was it called? The house, Netherfield Park. Netherfield Park was a big country house quite next to Longbourn House, which is where the Bennets lived. So he was renting, and during the novel it becomes obvious that his sisters are going crazy. He had a huge amount of money that he was getting interest off for living, but they wanted him to buy an estate. They were desperate for him to buy an estate, because that would have made him landed gentry and put them on a higher social status and improve their marriage prospects. And actually, at the end of the novel, he does buy an estate, which is much to the relief of his sisters. So, yeah, his father, I mean, even worse, Bingley's father had got his huge amount of money in trade. And so those girls were really down in the marriage market until he became a member of the landed gentry. But that was it. It was owning land, and the more land, the more respectable you were. However, after 1918, all those laws had to be changed. Most of the soldiers who were fighting during the First World War didn't have a vote, because they were from the working classes or even the middle classes, and they were sons of people who owned houses. And so they didn't have a vote. And then women also were taking part in the war, and so that was also recognised. It became obvious that it wasn't just knights and barons who would be fighting for the country in future. There were not only women being nurses, but there were great heroines as well, spies, and there was the yeomanry, the nursing yeomanry. I've forgotten the whole name of it. Anyway, the nursing. I'm getting passionate again, and my friend is here to comfort me. All you can see is his nose. The nursing yeomanry, who actually went out into the field to administer first aid to wounded soldiers until transport could be got for them. So, I mean, people recognised all of this. And so after 1918, women were given the vote. Well, sort of. Only if they were over 30 and only if they were property owners. Men, however, got the vote across the board. Any man over 21 could vote. It wasn't until 1928 that women got the vote across the board after the age of 21 as well. And that's because the government was worried that because so many men had died, the country, they had this horror story of the country being swamped by female votes. That is, again, another story. And you have to remember that when women were given the vote, if they were property owners and over the age of 30, that would cut down a lot because a lot of women weren't property owners. Their husbands owned their houses and they weren't property owners. And you have to also understand that women mostly couldn't get mortgages. Banks wouldn't give women mortgages unless the mortgage was signed off by a male relative. So, you know, that's how democracy works. It creeps. It's all very well saying, let's change everything at once. I wouldn't have liked to have been a woman in those times, but I can understand why it happened. Okay, right, so men got the vote across the board, and then there was the Equal Franchise Act 1928, and that evened everything out. At which point the ability to vote, and now I'm talking about national elections, stopped having anything to do with people having a stake in society. And that's where things started going downhill. As is often the case, it stayed on equilibrium for a while and then it started to crumble, as frequently happens with things like this. Voters became more irresponsible, and this started, I suppose, around the 1960s. And now we have a situation where in the inner cities, and this applies everywhere in the world, voters, and I'm talking about Britain especially, where we have a large immigrant population, and I'm not just talking about illegal immigrants, I'm talking about legal ones, but many of them are here and don't really speak English that well. They don't understand the history or the culture. They don't feel any need to. And say in the case particularly of well, certain groups, I have to be careful what I say here on YouTube anyway, they will vote for ethnic representatives who may not be very good, but who they see as serving their interest. Or they will vote for people who offer them the most handouts. And this is where the socialist government comes in, because especially in North London, it's the areas where there are the most number of people on some sort of public assistance that you get the most density of voters for Labour councils. And as well as that, you have students. Now, say a city like Oxford, it's got a huge number of students and they have absolutely no stake in society, students. They're most of them too young to have families, and many of them don't come from Oxford. So they feel they have no stake. And I might say that I do know that it's quite common for students to cheat on these. They are registered as living, I don't know what, say in Birmingham, but they go to Oxford, so and they're there in Oxford, and they might vote in both places in national elections. It's very difficult to catch such people, and they think they're doing good. Of course, that is the sort of thing that a student would do without thinking too much about the consequences of that. So anyway, that's the problem. You know, students, ethnic minorities, very poor people, they're not voting according to what they think of as having an influence for the best of the country, but just for their for their community or themselves. And it's definitely a problem of democracy, which brings me back to the beginning of what I was saying. Now, how to solve this? Well, I'm tempted to say property ownership, but definitely that sort of a system is open to even more abuses. And obviously no political party would try to pass such a law, and I'm not sure I would either, given half a chance. But that is one crude indicator of how much of a stake you have in the particular, in your country or the area where you live. So now I am actually going right back to the beginning of this video and talking about the accusation that was levelled at me that I'm constantly positing questions that have no answers. And I have no answer to this one. And I would very much be interested if you think you have one, because I don't see anything, and I'm not all that stupid, but I could have missed something there. So I want you to tell me, and I'll give you till next time to think about it. Till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the granniopteryx design or Granbo, with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.granniopteryx.com, and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.